Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the ACS San Francisco Bay Chapter monthly speaker event, the fourth Tuesday of the month. So mark that down, the fourth Tuesday of every month. I'm Susan Hopp, a board member, and I'm here with fellow board member Izzy Shapanyak. And for anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, ACS began in 1967 and is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and grants toward marine research. And regarding our grants, we are now accepting grant applications through a link on our website. So we so appreciate your donations in support of our mission. They support our expenses around these monthly talks, as well as funding our grants and the research that comes out of it. And so to our donors, a very big thank you. So we are recording this session and we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. And after the presentation, we'll do our best to get to them. And tonight, we are staying local with eyes and ears on our own slice of ocean paradise. Tonight's talk is San Francisco Bay and increased use by cetaceans, conservation success stories and challenges. And let me introduce someone that I call a local rock star of marine biologists. Dr. Tim Markowitz is Cetacean Field Research Coordinator at the Marine Mammal Center, where he oversees research projects examining humpback whales, bottlenose dolphins, and harbor porpoises in San Francisco Bay and the surrounding waters. His research has expanded understanding of harbor porpoise reproductive and foraging behavior, northward range expansion of coastal bottlenose dolphins, and humpback whale abundance, movements, and habitat use. And since joining the center, the Marine Mammal Center as Cetacean Field Research Coordinator in 2019, he has expanded his research efforts to include gray whales and a focus on conservation issue for whales, dolphins, and porpoises, including vessel interactions, fisheries bycatch, and climate change. Tim continues to hold part-time positions at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, teaching classes in the departments of biology and environmental science, policy, and management, and advising graduate students conducting marine mammal research. Tim received his BA from UC Santa Cruz in Environmental Studies, his Master's of Science from UC Davis in Animal Science, and his PhD from Texas A&M University in Wildlife and Fisheries Sciences. From Alaska to New Zealand, Tim has studied orcas and humpbacks, beluga whales and sperm whales, dusky dolphins, and fur seals. So Tim, thank you for turning your spotlight on San Francisco Bay and sharing what you know with us.
Ooh. Thanks for having me. Everybody hear me okay? Coming through loud and clear? All right. Well, welcome everybody. As a San Francisco Bay Area native, I have to say it's been wonderful to return home after traveling all over the planet and studying marine mammals in various locations, and to come back to San Francisco Bay. And of course, one of the things that's really amazing and not lost on me or any of us who've spent time in the San Francisco Bay Area over the years is the fact that we now routinely have 4 species of cetaceans in San Francisco Bay, something that was really pretty unheard of when I was growing up in the Bay Area. You would occasionally get a whale that would wander into the bay, and that would be a big deal. Now on a daily basis, we have porpoises, sometimes dolphins, seasonally whales in San Francisco Bay. So what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is this increased use of the bay by cetaceans and the fact that this really relates to some conservation success stories. It relates to populations of animals that are recovering with protection. And it also relates to a cleaner environment for them to live and thrive in. Now, as they come into this environment, they enter a fairly busy urbanized area. And that results in greater potential overlap and interaction with various vessel traffic. And so this could be somewhat of a challenge as well. And we'll talk about this with respect to the 4 species we now most commonly see here. I would be remiss if I did not start off by really emphasizing the fact that this is a team effort and has been from the very beginning. So I want to give a shout out to the research associates that I work with at the Marine Mammal Center. That includes the great Bill Keener, Mark Weber, and some of you may know this fellow, Izzy Shaponiak, otherwise known as the Kapua Kahuna. I just call him Big Kahuna. And many other colleagues we've worked with through the years, including the late, great Jonathan Stern, who really helped kick off a lot of the early research that our team did on harbor porpoises. At first, just watching them from this platform you could see behind over Bill's shoulder here and over my shoulder as well, the Golden Gate Bridge. Also, we've had the great fortune to work with some amazing graduate students. Currently, we are working with Allison Payne, AKA Whale Girl, and Becca Lane, and they are both completing their master's degrees at the EOS Center, San Francisco State University, with the excellent mentorship of Ellen Hines. And Allison is working on photographic identification and entanglement histories of humpback whales in the area to address the issue of fisheries entanglement. And Becca Lane is developing ship strike risk assessment models also for San Francisco Bay and the immediately adjacent waters. So here we have San Francisco Bay. It is both new and old habitat for cetaceans. And we're going to talk about the fact that we have here now 4 different species from 4 different families of cetaceans, quite relatively distant relatives. So we have different life histories, different stories, and one thing in common, this use of San Francisco Bay. So the first cetaceans we saw coming into San Francisco Bay, really returning to the bay in relatively large numbers, and you can still find them in San Francisco Bay virtually every day of the year, are harbor porpoises. Next, we saw coming into the bay, perhaps for the first time, certainly for the first time in modern history, coastal bottlenose dolphins from the California stock. We also have gray whales. Now, gray whales have always come through San Francisco Bay and the surrounding area on their northward migration. But in recent years in particular, we've seen really prolonged migratory stopovers where they're entering the bay and our photo identification work has shown they're staying in San Francisco Bay for weeks, in some cases months on end. And humpback whales, which have made quite a splash recently. So let's get into each of these 4 species and talk a little bit about what's going on with each of them. So as I mentioned, harbor porpoises, you return to San Francisco Bay. They reoccupied San Francisco Bay after an absence of more than 60 years. And they were first documented coming into the bay in 2008. And we believe there are a couple of things going on. The bay is a lot cleaner now than it once was, and there's abundant food resources for them in this area. I mentioned they were once found in San Francisco Bay, and if you go over by the UC Berkeley campus in the East Bay, where I teach, and you take the Shell Mound Street exit, that Shell Mound Street exit in Emeryville is named for this Emeryville shell mound, which was excavated, and within that shell mound were found remains of harbor porpoises dating back 400 to 2,700 years before the present time. So we know that they have been historically present in San Francisco Bay. Now, if we move into the modern era, there are a number of sort of large scale changes in the bay. So we had, the building of an artificial island, the Angel Island, and also a lot of infilling and a large amount of pollution dumped into San Francisco Bay. And here we have a pretty early record. So this is from the University of California, Berkeley, and researchers there, the amazing Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, here collected a specimen. And I have to say, this is a much better drawing than I could do. And they took measurements, clearly a harbor porpoise that they described having taken it inside San Francisco Bay at Point Richmond in 1939. So we know that there were harbor porpoises still around at that time. What happened next? What happened next was World War II. And with World War II, a large submarine net and torpedo protecting net was placed along the Narrows. Again, sort of right behind me here, just outside the Golden Gate Bridge. And in fact, that San Francisco State University Estuary and Ocean Science Center, the EOS Center, is the location where these nets were originally made. And you can still see the imprints in the parking lot of where they constructed these nets to stretch across the bay. And you could see there's a pretty sort of wide space here. And just to make sure nothing got through, they went ahead and tied these extra wires and twine across. So really nothing could get through. Any marine mammal that happened along that way would have actually become entangled and not been able to get sort of in or out of the bay. So that appears to be the last time that harbor porpoises were found in San Francisco Bay until 2008. And then suddenly, here they were again. And so now, as I said, on a daily basis, you can go to certain places in San Francisco Bay. You may be able to see harbor porpoises from shore or from a boat or from the Golden Gate Bridge. And our team discovered pretty early on that the Golden Gate Bridge provided an amazing research platform, sort of the perfect research blind. We were up above the animals and we could see what they were doing. We could count the number of individuals and so on. This work was really published by that research charge led, again, by the late, great Jonathan Stern. And you can see here also a picture of our colleague, Bill Keener, with his long lens taking some amazing photographs. He's taken countless photographs from this research platform. And you could see at times really quite high numbers, very at times counts well over 100 porpoises counted in a single day passing beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. So as a general rule, we find them coming in with the tide and going out with the tide. So they're most commonly seen in this area around the high tide. Now, harbor porpoises are not the most easily photographically identified of cetaceans, but some do have markings we can use. And so you can see here, here's an individual that was photographed off Alcatraz in 2010, and then later in 2015 with a calf near Angel Island. The same marking here, same small scar in the trailing edge of the dorsal fin. Since these animals are relatively short-lived, this is a considerable sort of slice of the life of this individual. Our work to expand knowledge of individual harbor porpoises, where they come and go, as well as their numbers, continues. They are pretty tricky to approach at sea and photograph. And so, as I said, being able to photograph them from the vantage of the Golden Gate Bridge gave us some opportunities to get some new insights into their lives. And so one of the things that we were able to see, and you can see here a photograph taken by another one of our collaborators, amazing photographer, Flip Nicklin. You could see here a harbor porpoise chasing a small fish. This is the sort of thing we often see. And then turning laterally, right, on its side in order to be able to twist and turn and more effectively chase after that small fish. We also started learning some things about harbor porpoise reproduction. Harbor porpoises generally have a gestation length of 10.5 months with the calves born in the summer. And we do see a lot of calves here. And an interbirth interval typically of every other year. Effectively, this means that for an adult female harbor porpoise, she is constantly pregnant or lactating. She's almost always a mother throughout her life. Very busy life for female harbor porpoises. So then we started seeing something from the Golden Gate Bridge that really hadn't been seen before. And I'm just going to zoom in on this picture here. I believe this is another one of Bill Keener's great photos. So we could look a little bit more closely at what's going on here. So here we have one individual that's leaping out of the air, another one below. And of course, I think everybody in this crowd knows porpoises, like us, have arms, but unlike us, have no legs. So this appendage sticking out here must be something else. And in fact, harbor porpoises are somewhat famous in this regard, also famous for their unusually large testes. Basically, a small harbor porpoise has a testis size equivalent to that of a fin whale. So we started noticing this very dramatic aerial behavior apparently associated with reproduction. So when we think about harbor porpoise reproduction, they have a pretty short life. They only live 10 to 12 years on average. They have synchronized seasonal breeding, and they're sexually dimorphic, with the males being actually 10% smaller than the females. And we see seasonal enlargement of the testes to this sort of mega testis size, and a relatively large penis for such a small odontocete. They're promiscuous maters, and it's likely that there is sperm competition based on all of this. So then we started taking high-resolution photographs and videos, digital video, of this behavior whenever we saw it. And we noticed a curious thing. Very often, the sort of nature in which this would occur is that the males would sort of seem to kind of come out of nowhere. Lone males, typically, approaching lone females, or sometimes females with calves. And they might approach from the left-hand side, They might approach from directly behind her, underneath her, or from the right-hand side. Reasonably even distribution there. But as they came up and made contact or got closest to that female, it was always on the left-hand side. So in 142 documented cases, we saw always this lateralized approach. And we thought, well, maybe, these harbor porpoises are from San Francisco Bay Area. Maybe they're just leftists because they're always approaching from the left-hand side. We published this work in a Keener et al. Publication in Aquatic Mammals. And here we could see, of course, when you have mating, we have breeding, you wait several months, and then lo and behold, you see that same individual potentially with a calf. And that is the case for this dolphin. This was an unusually deformed individual. We named her scoliosis. But she was still able to swim around just fine with this deformity, and you can see she did successfully have a calf. So then we began to compare notes with other researchers, and Mark Weber on our team kind of took the charge, led the charge in this, and went right around the planet, talking to everyone he knew that worked with harbor porpoises. And the question he had for them was, have you seen any of this sort of aerial splashy behavior? And do you have high resolution photographs or video of this behavior? And lo and behold, we came to find out that this reproductive behavior was generally accompanied by this sort of aerial behavior with the male thrusting up from the left-hand side against the female. And in almost every case, except the jury may still be out in Monterey Bay, the males always have made that last sexual approach on the left-hand side. I might add that in our case, as I mentioned, they sometimes start on the right-hand side, swim around to the left-hand side in order to approach from that direction. So this seemed pretty curious, and subsequently, we did some work with Dara Orbach and her colleagues. Dara's at Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi, and she was looking at postmortem specimens of female harbor porpoise. And you could see here, this is the male penis, and then this is the female reproductive tract. And you can see there's kind of an amazing similarity or particular kind of fit to it. And so it's been proposed that perhaps this is a case of a sort of lock and key coevolution between the male anatomy and in fact behavior, in this case with this sort of left-sided approach, and the female anatomy. So that was a harbor porpoise. Now, relatively recently, we started to also see bottlenose dolphins in the San Francisco Bay Area. And again, growing up here, in the 1970s and 1980s, never saw bottlenose dolphins up in this neck of the woods. The very first sightings really in San Francisco Bay occurred in the early 2000s, in 2001. And we started getting photographs of them beginning in 2007 in San Francisco Bay. And so here you could see positions in, there's the San Francisco Bay, the Bay Area here, and on down to this is Monterey Bay. So there were no bottlenose dolphins during the 1980s. In the 1990s, we started having bottlenose dolphin sightings in Monterey Bay. Those continued through the 2000s with the first documented photo ID dolphins coming on up into San Francisco Bay at that time. But it is really in this most recent decade, in the 2010s, and on through to the present, that we've seen bottlenose dolphins move on up into San Francisco Bay, and in some cases beyond to Marin and Sonoma counties, and all the way up, in fact, to Mendocino County. So how are we keeping track of these guys? Well, unlike the harbor porpoises, bottlenose dolphins are readily identifiable using photo identification. Most adult dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, are very well marked. And in fact, they're also relatively long-lived. So they acquire those marks in the dorsal fin over time, and you can track them over a long period of time. So if we take a look here at our catalog these are individuals that we photographed in the San Francisco Bay. We've got up to as many as 101 adults, which is roughly 20% of the entire stock of West Coast coastal bottlenose dolphins. And this is an example here, Bliss, a female that was first identified and photographed in San Diego in 1982. So when we look at these relative newcomers to our area, what we see is many of them pass through. Maybe we get a sighting or two of them, but others will stay for a time or come and go, and we see them repeatedly over time. We can also see after those first few years where there wasn't as much of a dedicated research effort, few individuals photographed, we had a kind of regular discovery curve that went up and up and up on through 2018, and we could extend this now up to the present. So where were they coming from? If we look sort of more broadly at where these dolphins began their lives. So here on the left-hand side, we're looking again at the 1980s, here the 2000s, and here the 2010s, and now on into, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and the 2010s. And so what you can see here is these are the same individual dolphins that we have photographed here in San Francisco Bay. And many of them, in fact, pretty much all of them, began their lives down in Southern California. So down in this area, including Santa Barbara, the SoCal Bight, Los Angeles, and on down to San Diego. And so if we look at this, how far these individuals could be identified from the southernmost sighting for this stock being in Ensenada, Mexico. You can see here this pretty large change on average, at least for these particular dolphins that we're finding up in our neck of the woods, moving up the coast, 100, 200, in some cases 250 kilometers on average each decade, from the 1980s through this past decade. And we can break this down further, of course, because we have individual histories for all these dolphins. And I'll just show you a few here that are sort of samples of what those movement patterns for individuals would be like. And I would certainly be remiss if I failed to mention a dolphin named Miss, because Miss began her life here. She was first photographed down in this area in San Diego and Los Angeles in the 1980s. Did a little bit of back and forth movements, but generally moved on up through the 1990s to the Monterey Bay area, arriving up here in the San Francisco Bay area beginning about 2012. And again, she had some reversals, some back and forth, but generally a pretty strong northward trend or trajectory to her movements, and eventually made it all the way up to Puget Sound, along with a few other dolphins in our catalog. So this is really the longest kind of movement that has been demonstrated for this group of animals. A pretty amazing feat to have started your life in San Diego and end up in this place. And I show you this picture in particular just to demonstrate. This is a coastal bottlenose dolphin of the coastal California stock that's not in California anymore. It's definitely not in San Diego or Los Angeles, but rather way up here in the Pacific Northwest. Other cases included this dolphin I showed you a photograph of before, Bliss. Now, Bliss also had a pretty strong northward trajectory, but ended up just going up to the northern part of California, at least as far as we got photos, and then returning back down to San Francisco Bay. Another individual we have a lot of photo identification records for is, we call him Smooch. And Smooch, you can see, is a big time back and forther. So Smooch sort of began down here in the San Diego area, came up to Santa Barbara, made his way up here to Monterey Bay, and then back down again, and then eventually all the way down to Mexico, and then continuing this back and forth on up to San Francisco Bay Area. So a lot of back and forth movement right along from Southern California to Northern California. So this is not some unidirectional migration or movement of the entire population. Rather, what we believe we're seeing is an expansion of the overall range for this group of dolphins, with now a significant proportion of them occurring, at least at times, in San Francisco Bay and around the surrounding areas. And then here's another sort of more local dolphin that's shown quite a bit of back and forth between the San Francisco Bay and immediate area around here, on up into sort of the counties to the north, getting on up into Marin, Sonoma, and then also down to Monterey Bay in the south. I mentioned some dolphins stick around. Here's a dolphin named Kaimi. Now, with a group like this, I imagine maybe some of you have seen Kaimi in person. Kaimi was a dolphin that was most often solitary, occasionally had a companion, but remained in and around just offshore of Alameda in the East Bay for at least a 3-year period from 2016 through 2019. Very often was interacting with kayakers and boaters, and became quite popular with people in the area. As sometimes happens with these sort of lone sociable dolphins, Kaimi eventually kind of moved out of that area and was photographed further on outside the bay in a larger group of dolphins at a later date. So as bottlenose dolphins move up into San Francisco Bay and other areas up here to the north, they're moving into areas that are ecologically very different. So here, we have evidence for the first time of these animals catching and feeding on salmon. A couple cases we documented this in 2010 and again in 2015. Obviously, this is a prey species not available to bottlenose dolphins. Many of them, these very same dolphins, early in their lives that in Southern California, where you don't have populations of salmon. So they are finding and utilizing new food resources. And we also know that they are reproducing here, because we see mothers with young calves. And here you can see a couple cases of calves with fetal folds. So the dolphins typically have these fetal folds when they first emerge. They're sort of accordioned up inside the mother, and when they emerge, they kind of expand, you might say. And you end up with these very typical stretch marks, and usually varies a little bit from one species to another, but usually you only see these for a matter of weeks. So we know that these are, very young newborn animals. And so here's one off Fort Point, and another that was photographed at the Sutro Baths. And as I mentioned, we see bottlenose dolphins wandering in and out of San Francisco Bay, typically very close to along shore, places like Baker Beach, and then down south along the coast of some of the areas to the south, such as Pacifica. Now, coming up into this area, bottlenose dolphins are also encountering harbor porpoises, the aforementioned harbor porpoises. And so this has led to an uptick in porpoise mortality that can be attributed to fatal attacks by bottlenose dolphins. This has been seen in other places and has been termed porpoiside. And now we're seeing it fairly regularly here in San Francisco Bay. I should say when we say seeing it, it's rarely observed. So this is a rare case where an attack was actually witnessed and photographed by Tom Jefferson. But we do see post-mortem evidence, and our pathology team at the Marine Mammal Center very often documents this as a cause of death and a cause of increased mortality for harbor porpoises in and around the Bay Area. Okay, so that's the small cetaceans, including the harbor porpoises and bottlenose dolphins, both odontocetes, the one a member of the porpoise family, and the other a member of the dolphin family. And next we move to another species, a rorqual whale, the humpback whale. And humpbacks have made kind of a pretty large splash in the Bay Area over the last 5 years. They use this larger general area as their summer feeding grounds. And that includes places offshore, out to the Farallon Islands, out in the marine sanctuaries. It includes areas down south in Monterey Bay and up along the shoreline and coastline, and most recently coming right into San Francisco Bay. And so we've been monitoring them. We've been seeing them in San Francisco Bay since 2016. And for those of you who know something about humpback whales, you probably are familiar with the very famous group of humpbacks that breeds in Hawaii and feeds mainly in Alaska. These are members of the same species, but not members of the same population. They belong to two different breeding groups. Unlike the aforementioned group, which is relatively abundant, these two are still listed under the Endangered Species Act. So the Central American breeders are listed as endangered, and those that breed in Mexico are listed as threatened. And our photo ID research has conclusively demonstrated that these are the animals that come up to this area to feed, and in some cases come right into San Francisco Bay. And as you can see, this individual here just underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. And that's one of the platforms we've used to observe them from, as well as from vessels and shore and the surrounding area. So humpback whales are rorquals. They have expandable throat pleats. They are among the fastest swimming of the baleen whales, and one of the few, relatively few baleen whales that routinely eat fish as well as zooplankton. And so if you take a close look at this photo here, you can see there's a bunch of small fish flying, and here most typically we see them feeding on northern anchovy. Particularly when they come inshore, we see more of this fish feeding. Sometimes we see some fish feeding slightly further offshore as well, but the whales offshore tend to feed more on plankton. This can make them relatively easily seen at the surface, at least at times, but they also spend quite a bit of time foraging and feeding at depth. And I'll show you some of the tag data there to indicate that. But they're harder to see, obviously, when they're submerged, and they are routinely living and feeding in these sort of busy waterways where there's quite a bit of vessel traffic. And this is one of the reasons why our team has really advocated that recreational boaters as well as commercial ships, whenever possible, slow down when humpback whales are in the area. How many whales are there? Well, that's changed over time. So here you could see, I said, they really started coming in big numbers. We had a few sightings in 2015, but really 2016 was sort of the first big year. What these different colored lines are showing you here is our early work. We were again watching from the platform of the Golden Gate Bridge. And so anything inside the bridge, right, to the east is in orange, sort of the color of the Golden Gate, and anything outside into the toward the ocean is blue. And so here you could see daily counts of humpback whales passing through underneath the bridge and on which side they could be found. So if whales went all the way in further into the bay, they were coated orange. If they remained out in the Golden Gate Strait, they were colored blue. And so relatively few in 2015, and then counts reaching on up to as many as 12 whales passing through the narrows of the Golden Gate in 2016. But then here along comes 2017, and we start to see much greater numbers in 2017 and 2018. And so it became sort of much more routine. We seemed to have lost the scale here, but we got up to peak numbers quite a bit over 10 or 12. I believe our maximum numbers were in excess of 20 in a given day. And there were times when you could stand on the bridge and look down and see half a dozen or more whales feeding at once. It's a pretty amazing sight to see. So, those are sort of counts, per day. But if we ask the question, when are they found there seasonally? And if we just ask, an overall average, and if you look closely at those past figures, there were periods of time when we didn't have any sightings. So those would be zeros within this data set. And so you could see, there is a pretty clear humpback whale season. And they tend to be around beginning in the spring, late spring mostly, peaking, their numbers peaking in the summer, but hanging out, remaining into the fall. And in fact, this year we had our earliest sighting of a humpback whale in San Francisco Bay yet. That was in March. Although the numbers this particular year have remained a little bit low to date. And that's because we're seeing larger feeding aggregations further outside the bay at the moment, perhaps related to all this windy weather we've been having and increased upwelling. So, here's where we have our sightings of humpback whales over the last 5 years. These are just one sighting per day per photo identified individual. So there's not a bunch of repeats in this diagram. And you can see there's quite a cluster here around the Golden Gate Bridge. And I did mention that, we've used this as a research platform, but we also get sightings from other shore stations and also from research vessels and whale watching vessels as well. Particularly a lot of those photo ID sightings come from that source. And one of the things we find right around here is pretty deep water as we move through the channel at this location. And if you've been boating around here, that when the tide hits things just right, there are a lot of almost, they look like whirlpools, eddies, swirling water, sort of perhaps associated with this underwater seamount, the Cavallo Spire, which sits just in there. And it does seem that both the harbor porpoises and humpback whales gather here, perhaps because prey are more concentrated at this location. So of course I mentioned we had to keep track, right, of who's who and how many whales are using this particular area. And we're now up to well over 60 whales coming into San Francisco Bay. Now these are really a subset of the larger group that uses the waters outside. And we know that these particular whales we photographed in the bay routinely come and go. They come and go within a day into and out of San Francisco Bay. So when do they come and go? And is there any sort of best time of day to find them? Well, the long and short, really the short answer there is they tend to come in with the flooding tide, be found further into the bay on average at the high tide. And then as the tide rolls back out, and especially around low tide, we see them further and further out to the west. That's the general rule of thumb. So, and you'll notice that also the number of sightings as we get to low tide is relatively low. That's because quite a few of these whales are sort of further outside the picture here. They've moved further offshore. And so if we look at sort of within the study area where we see these whales, again, by tidal state, and we've just used the average degrees longitude as sort of a proxy for how far east into the bay versus west out offshore we see these whales. Again, you can see here on the flooding tide and the high tide, we tend to see them quite often right underneath the Golden Gate Bridge or further inside indeed. And then as the tide goes out, we see them further and further offshore. So what are they doing, and how does, is there any interaction between the behavior of these animals as we document it and where we find them? Again, the sort of take-home message, if you look at this, is they tend to feed in relatively deep water compared to other behavioral states like traveling or if they're leaping, peck slapping, that sort of thing. But they also tend to feed relatively near shore. So in short, they tend to feed in deep waters found near shore. And so here, again, we have a humpback feeding. This is just inside the Golden Gate Bridge with those throat pleats extended. Almost looks like he might give an extra car wash to some of the cars parked along the shore. They're in very, very close proximity to the shoreline, but relatively deep water. And just to sort of overlay what's going on, if we look at those whales that are foraging and feeding, and we look at the effect of that behavior on where we find them. I mentioned the tidal state, has a strong influence, right? So at the high tide, regardless of behavior, they tend to be found further into the bay. But curiously, if we look around at the low tide, animals tend to stick around further into the bay if they are finding food there around the low tide. Now, they don't just feed in this dramatic surface gulping way where we get to see fish flying and we know, in fact, that they're feeding. We've tagged a few of these individuals. Cascadia Research Collective, their team led by John Kalmakitis and James Falbish, collected these data. They tagged a few individual whales. And you could see here, these were whales that were tagged for a length of time. This is really one portion of their dive record. But you can see them consistently diving into relatively deep water down to about 30 meters. And then each of these little diamonds here represents a feeding lunge. So these are two whales, not necessarily feeding in unison, but apparently diving in the same depths and engaged in feeding behavior at the same time. And that feeding behavior occurred down here where you wouldn't see it. In fact, in a lot of cases, if we see whales sort of going back and forth and diving a bit at the surface, we might have characterized that superficially from what we could see in the air as some kind of milling behavior. But this indicates, in fact, at least these individuals were actively feeding just at depth. And so here you can see some of that dive data with the mean dive depth, durations of dives. Notice here typically about a minute. And then also their time at depth and the percent time spent at various depths. And one of the things we note here is they actually spend a considerable amount of time in relatively shallow water, right? About half their time on average. Now, this is a small sample, and we would like to do some more tagging work in the future to kind of see some of the variability around this, especially for these animals inshore. But a take-home message for this is as well, if you were looking at the bay or perhaps driving your boat across the bay, if there are whales in the area, you never know. One might pop up right in front of you or quite nearby that you didn't realize was there at all. And so, there is this potential for interactions with vessels, including large vessels for humpback whales in San Francisco Bay and surrounding waters. The main place that we see a lot of overlap between where there are large numbers of whales and ships come and go for humpback whales is in the Golden Gate Strait and Narrows, but also occasionally, as you can see in this case, further into the bay. So this does present a risk, potential navigation hazard for vessels, but also a risk of mortality for these humpback whales. And there have been whales struck and killed by vessels in San Francisco Bay as well as surrounding areas. Okay, so this leads us to our last species to talk about here. Last but not least are the gray whales. And as I said at the outset, promised to tell you we've got 4 different species, 4 different families. So we have the porpoise family, the dolphin family, the rorquals, and then we have the lone member of these Shrictidae, the gray whale. And it is also the only benthic foraging baleen whale. Now, unlike the other animals we've talked about, where San Francisco Bay might be a place you live year-round, a place you visit occasionally, or a foraging feeding destination, for these gray whales, San Francisco Bay is just a stop along the way, right? As they undertake one of the longest migrations we see in nature, traveling from their winter breeding grounds in San Ignacio Lagoon and other places, Baja, Mexico, to their Arctic summer feeding grounds. And so typically when we've seen them coming into the bay, it's on their northward migration. That's when they pass most closely and sometimes come into the bay. And over the last few years, NOAA declared an unusual mortality event. That's due to large numbers of gray whales starving and dying along not just our local coast here, but along the entire length of their range. Now, one of the things people forget, it's easy to forget with these particular creatures, is if they're malnourished or starving on their northward migration, that is generally because they didn't feed well the previous summer in the Arctic, because they tend not to feed much when they leave their feeding grounds, travel down all the way down to their breeding grounds, and then they're on their way back up to feed again. So it makes sense that, it's been a long time since they've had abundant foraging, and if they didn't forage well the previous summer season, they might be struggling considerably. Now, what our team has found is that they've had really, we've had increased numbers of gray whales coming right into San Francisco Bay during this unusual mortality event, and that they have stayed in the bay. And we have confirmed this using identification photographs. The photo ID is not as easy to do with gray whales as with humpbacks or bottlenose dolphins, but we can match individuals both by spot patterns along their sides, along the right and left sides, as well as from fluke shots when they show us their flukes. And so this has confirmed some individuals staying for weeks or months in San Francisco Bay. So as I mentioned, gray whales are benthic feeders. They're the only baleen whale. They have the shortest baleen, and they swim on their sides and they sort of rake along the seafloor. We saw, beginning in 2019, what we suspected might be some foraging or feeding behavior in San Francisco Bay, but we couldn't confirm it. We just sort of noticed that they were hanging out and diving a lot in particular areas. And we had suspicions, but no confirmation, really. But it was this year, in 2021, that we confirmed foraging because or feeding, because we saw these whales diving repeatedly and large mud plumes coming up, indicating that they were raking the bottom. Subsequently, two of the whales that died, there have been a number that died in San Francisco Bay. Two of the whales that died in San Francisco Bay had stomach contents, also indicating that they had been actively and recently feeding. These animals are, very kind of slow-moving, quiet animals. They don't display as much. They have a lower blow. They are harder to see if you were out boating in the bay. So again, if there were gray whales in the bay, they're very often in sort of a weakened state. We encourage everyone to slow down and give them a wide berth. But we documented these animals feeding with dive times ranging from 5 to 8 minutes in relatively shallow water, well inside the bay. So I'll show you some distribution here. So this area we were seeing the gray whales feeding this past year was basically in this area between kind of Angel Island, Alcatraz, and Treasure Island in relatively shallow water. And we've also seen them pretty heavily just inside Angel Island, apparently diving in a way that makes us suspect they may have been feeding there, and then on up through Raccoon Strait. So this is a distribution that's quite different from the humpback whales. They don't appear to come and go on the tides on any kind of regular diurnal basis, or have any kind of clear daily pattern of movement like that. And they do come and stay, or have been staying for quite a while in this relatively close inshore area. So the potential for vessel interaction for gray whales has increased during the UME. I should add that these gray whales are not endangered or threatened. They are relatively abundant. And this may also relate to the reason why you have more and more whales sharing the same food source. And if the food is less available, that is one of the sort of proposed hypotheses for why there have been these die-offs. But from our research, we know they have been coming into San Francisco Bay presumably to rest, seek shelter, as well as apparently to feed, to try and bulk up with a little more energy to continue and complete their northward migration. And actually, I should add our photo identification work. We have compared images of gray whales taken further up the coast. And while I think everyone's aware, you've seen it in the news, a number of gray whales have died in San Francisco Bay and surrounding areas. Others have done apparently just fine and gone on, left the Bay Area and continued their northward migration. We see the greatest numbers of gray whales in the spring, in March through May. And again, they're often found well inside San Francisco Bay, near Angel, Alcatraz, and Treasure Islands. And this means they overlap with both commercial shipping lanes and also ferry routes, as well as recreational boating traffic, sailboats, motorboats, and everything else in the inner bay. So this is just a look at those two species of whales. We've sort of overlaid our position data for unique daily sightings of particular individuals. And in blue, you can see here are the humpback whales, and it's sort of yellowy orange are the gray whales. And so we find them, in different parts, utilizing typically different parts of the bay. Of course, there is some overlap. So we do see gray whales further out through the Golden Gate Strait. And we do see humpback whales, well inside, even the Bay Bridge. So they do at times come in there and the gray whales do at times go out. But generally we see gray whales further into the bay and that they're doing less movement in and out of San Francisco Bay while they're here. Here's a look over the past 5 years at our sightings of whales by year. This is just sort of the sum total sightings, just to give you an idea of where the peaks and valleys are. And you can see definitely, as a general rule of thumb, peaks during the summers for humpback whales, quite high numbers in 2017 and 2018, somewhat fewer in 2019. This dip in 2020 could be related to challenges we had in effort related to the shelter-in-place orders. And then here, a little uptick again in 2021. Of course, these are the same individuals, as I said, and we know many of them, have recently photographed some of them, just a little bit further offshore, outside the bay and along shore in adjacent areas. And then here we have in orange, the gray whales, and you could see really none of them, right, in San Francisco Bay up until 2018. And this is kind of interesting because we picked up a little bit of a signal, an uptick in use of San Francisco Bay prior to the UME being declared in 2019. So we're already starting to see more animals coming into and seeking shelter in the bay, and that has continued over the last few years. If we look at sightings by month and talk about sort of the seasonality, one take-home message here is, over the past 5 years, on average, there's no whale-free month in San Francisco Bay. You can find whales of one species or the other every month of the year in the bay. Now, of course, as I said, we see the greatest number of gray whales in the spring, and we see the greatest number of humpback whales typically in the summer. So our research team at the Marine Mammal Center, we feel like this is work in a lot of ways. It's just getting started. We are working to build out better and more efficient photo identification catalogs. We collect photos from any source, and we have a lot of citizen scientists and the public that if they're out on the day and happen to photograph an individual, they send us that photographic record. And we go out on regular research surveys, as we are here on our small research vessel, as well as using other platforms such as whale watching vessels and shore-based observations. And we try as best we can to communicate information, especially about whale presence with the public. Again, just to sort of get the word out and reduce some of those risks of ship strike, as well as to let people know we've got whales in the bay. So that's sort of what we've been doing. I've left a bit of time for questions, and I'm happy to field any.
Thanks, Tim. Fantastic. It's just so, I don't know what, exciting and enthralling to know, and enthralling to know that we all can just go on the Golden Gate Bridge, or go to some lookout points in our own bay, and with the chance of seeing these amazing creatures. So anyway, we've got a lot of really good questions. So let me get started.
All right.
Okay, well, going back, I think to the related to the slides on the slide on the porpoise, and you showed the one a sexual act, and then the mother with the baby a good number of months later. What is the gestation period for porpoises?
10.5 months on
10
average.
and a half months.
Right. And they have a calf every other year. And remember, they only live to be 10 or 12 years old. So once those females are mature, they have very, very busy lives, right on through. So they're generally pregnant or lactating all the time. So amazing, amazing feat for sure.
Right. So more to the mothers. Okay. And then on regarding dolphins, you mentioned, I think, a dolphin that you all have witnessed, or observed, going back to like 1982. What do you think is what's the oldest observed dolphin?
Oh gosh, in our data set, that's probably close to the old, those going back to the early 80s, and then on up through now, or the last couple of years. So that's quite a span, right? 30 some years. I would have to double check
Okay.
in our catalog. Izzy might know. He's sitting next to you. He might know the exact number. He's looking it up right now. The Kahuna. I always get it wrong.
Kahuna. Yeah, we first started seeing bottlenose dolphins in this area in 1982 along the coast of Pacifica. And in fact, your dad was one of the people who was collecting data with me during that time. And then we had a period of time between like 1986 until 1990 where we didn't see anything. Then we had a rash of sightings again in the early 90s. And then about 94, we stopped seeing them, and we didn't start seeing them again until 2007.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Great.
I was amazed when I first saw them up here along the coast. What is that dolphin doing here?
So we had a good number of questions regarding the porpoiside. And one was related to, are the attacks territorial in nature? Another question was, is there any evidence of the dolphin eating parts of the porpoise, consuming it? And just generally, what are the explanations? Why? What is the nature of the dolphin aggressiveness?
Sure. One of the things we see is that there are particular dolphins, and this has been documented in a number of places, that are more likely to be, shall we say, repeat offenders, porpoisidal dolphins. They tend to be kind of subadult male dolphins. And the other same thing we see with bottlenose dolphins, I know everybody thinks dolphins are so gentle and sweet, and that's maybe true for most dolphin species, but bottlenose dolphins are quite brutish. That's the reason they are so well marked. They beat each other up all the time, routinely. And one of the things that's been documented in more than one instance is infanticide, in which male bottlenose dolphins actually kill calves, kill baby dolphins. And it's thought that they may do this in order to bring females into estrus or increase their mating opportunities. In the case of these sort of younger males, who knows, it might be some form of frustration. I do know a fellow who's publishing on this very subject of infanticide in dolphins. He's sitting next to you, so he may have more to add, but that seems to me to be the best explanation that I have heard for why we see this porpoiside. It's been documented in the UK previous to here. We're seeing it here now because we have dolphins and porpoises in the same place here now.
Yeah, Tim, just to add to what you said, I agree 100% with you. And the interesting thing is harbor porpoise adults are about the same size as bottlenose dolphin calves. So it could be a transferable behavior.
Yes. Yes. And incidentally, you know, the way that this is conclusively determined, except in those rare cases in which it's actually witnessed at the time, is you know, in post-mortem necropsies. So they'll see very specific indications of you know, trauma, rake marks, you know, wounds inflicted by bottlenose dolphins on porpoises, harbor porpoises.
All right, another question was related to the distance that the mapping of the dolphin up and down the coast. And the question was, are there any conclusions or speculation? Is it related to the temperature of the water? I mean, it kind of, looking at that, it kind of reminded me of, you know, just how humans are too, you know, like humans might bop back down to visit family, but prefer to live another place. But of course we don't want to anthropomorphize, but yeah,
Yeah, so our suspicion, I mean, I think there's two things. You know, one thing you can certainly conclude is that it's not a sort of unidirectional one-way move, at least for all of the dolphins, right? Some have moved pretty steadily, marched pretty steadily north. Others go back and forth. And that's why I showed, you know, some of those individual, you know, life history cases. But there has been, for some of this population, definitely a range expansion to the north. And when we actually look at the timing of when that occurred, first coming up really to Monterey Bay, and then moving further up to San Francisco Bay and beyond. If we look at, you know, what was going on at that time, we do see warming and major environmental events like El Nino events that seem to be related to this movement pattern. So, you know, I think in the case of the bottlenose dolphins moving on up, it's likely related to climate change. And it appears also, if we look at the UME, you know, that's still under investigation, but the previous UME we know was linked to an El Nino event, to environmental change. It seems likely that this one is linked to environmental change, particularly up in the Arctic. It would affect their food availability in their feeding grounds.
okay. Well, I guess related maybe to UME's unusual mortality events, there's a question, did you hear about the beached whale that showed up at Ocean Beach this week? Do you happen to know what kind of whale that would be?
Yes, I believe it was another gray whale this week? I did see that one. I didn't see it personally. I was not there. But yeah, I believe it was another gray whale. We can confirm that though. I'd have to grab my cell phone really quick to double check.
Okay, let's see. There was a question about bottlenose dolphins that, did I understand correctly, there are only 500 coastal bottlenose dolphins along the entire US West Coast. are there also significant offshore populations?
Yes and yes. Now, it may be that the stock numbers need updating, but the best available information we have is that this is still a small population. Now, it may be that what we're seeing with this range expansion is, in fact, the numbers down south have remained steady, right? And the population has increased and it's expanded due to a increase in the number of dolphins. But I'd say the jury's still out on that at this point. It may simply be that 500 dolphins that is sort of the established stock size has simply spread out in geographic extent. So I don't think we can say conclusively one way or the other, which is happening right now, but it is under investigation.
Okay, this I think was related to, well, you tell me what it's related to, but do you also see them? So it was it gray whales or humpbacks feed on krill inside the bay?
I haven't. They seem to be feeding on krill further out toward the Farallon Islands typically. And again, I have a report just recently from a fellow we both know of large feeding aggregations, including fish feeding. Not way offshore, but well outside the bay recently. So, these animals and marine mammals in general are quite good at going where the food is. My hunch with the humpback whales is that some, maybe not all of them, are more likely to come right inshore when the food is not super abundant offshore. And so it's not necessarily that there's not food for them in here now. It's just there's so much food offshore, they're staying offshore at the moment. But we've had a few visitors to the bay this year, and we expect any day now we're going to see them start coming on in through under the Golden Gate.
Okay, staying with their food. This is a question. What were the stomach contents of the gray whales, which apparently were feeding in SF Bay? I think you made a reference to that. So I think any additional explanation?
Okay, so that also is under investigation in terms of really doing a proper scientific account. But there was an indication of at least some food, as well as mud and muck, and I think there might have been some debris, some wood or something in one stomach. But there was at least some food. It's certainly an indication that they're trying to feed. And I might add, for these whales that are dying along our coast, the cause of death is clearly, they're very emaciated, is clearly starvation. Others, the cause of death has been determined to be vessel strike. And then others might be unknown, but it's not always the case that when a dead gray whale washes up along our shoreline, it's starving. So we have had some cases of whales that seem to be in pretty good physical condition wash ashore as well.
So let's stay with that for a minute. And there are a couple questions about, what can we do to, to make better policy or really force boat or ships? I mean, what is there anything that we can do to reduce, as citizens, reduce these ship strikes that are killing a lot of whales? And then related to that, Tim, Bonnie Gretz said the Salish Sea Whale Watch Association is using a whale tail flag when they're out observing whales to help private boaters and other commercial boats at least know there are whales around.
Mhm.
Is any move to adopt something like that in San Francisco Bay? It's really related. What can we do, whether to alert other boaters or, to do something more specific around the big freighters that especially come into San Francisco Bay every day?
Sure. So, our team is really working, as a first go to provide information in real time, or at least near real time, to the entire boating community. And we do that by informing the Coast Guard to let vessels know when there are whales in the area. We also gather a lot of information from the concerned public and from citizen scientists. So if you, see a whale in the bay, you could absolutely go online to the Marine Mammal Center website and report, those sightings. And we love to get that information. We especially love it if you have a camera and you take a picture. Even a poor quality photo, most of the time, will be enough for us to at least confirm the species. And a good quality photo might be enough for us to identify particular individual animals and kind of add that information to our data set and known positions of individual whales. So that's a couple things that we can do as a collaborative effort. Of course, folks can advocate for increasing either restrictions or voluntary slowdowns for vessels of all kinds in the bay. But then the other thing you can do, of course, is if you're out boating yourself, give these animals a wide berth. Enjoy them at a distance. That's generally wise. These are amazing gulp feeders. I'm sure some of you have heard in the news recently, there was a man engulfed off the East Coast by a feeding humpback whale. It's kind of a first, and he lived to tell. And we had a somewhat similar incident with a kayaker that got a little too close to feeding humpback whales down south of us in the San Luis Obispo area. So, enjoy them at a distance. When you see our research vessel here getting relatively close to these whales, we're doing so very carefully and under research permit from the federal government, from NOAA Fisheries. So generally, I'd advise you guys, they're big animals. You can enjoy them from afar and really slow down. If you know there are whales in the bay, and now you know generally when there are, right, in the spring and summer, slow down and be watchful and appreciate them and realize they may be there. I tend to think of it like a school zone. You slow down when there are kids present, right? The sign always says when there are kids present. That's when you slow down your car. The same thing here. There are whales present. You can help us spread the word. You can report when you see whales. And you can also, make sure to be that citizen that drives extra slow around these creatures.
Okay, continuing on human impact. This is a good question. How much does plastic contribute to cetacean deaths?
I would say relatively little. There are cases at times when animals may ingest inadvertently some plastic, but as a rule for these animals, that's a relatively small concern. Certainly for these great whales, the two largest concerns for humpbacks really are entanglement in fishing gear and vessel strike. Those are the two big ones.
Okay, we've had a few questions on this, which is how many about the grays within the bay are mother-baby pairs as opposed to solo travelers? And I think one observation, if they're migrating north, wouldn't they more likely have a calf with them?
That's a good question. I would have to double check our data on that. I think we've seen mostly solo individuals in the bay. But that's not to say there are no mothers and calves. There have been some passing through as well. So I think it's a mix, but I'd say if I were to guess, most of our sightings are solo individuals. Good question. I'll have to go data mine for that particular answer.
Okay, well, I think we're coming down to the end here. Let me just see if there's any that I've really missed. Let's see. How much of the increase in bay population, I don't know if that's, sightings, but is related to habitat compression. Hmm.
Habitat compression.
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, so I think there's a couple things going on. One, I think the bay is better habitat than it used to be for these animals. The bay has cleaned up over the years. I, for one, I'm one of those folks that celebrates the fact that we have a San Francisco Bay, thanks to those three amazing women from Berkeley,
Yeah.
that kind of really started this idea like we need to save the bay. And over time, with environmental protection, things have gotten better and better. They've gotten better and better on that front. Also, of course, with the end of whaling and the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, we've had greater protections for these animals. And so, one thing we sometimes talk about, people don't always realize, the last active whaling station in America was in San Francisco Bay, was in Richmond, and really not all that long ago. But here, these animals are making an amazing comeback. So, that's kind of the good news. When I hear habitat compression, I hear somebody getting at what's the bad news? If these are animals that would normally be offshore, do they come inshore because, the only food available for them is inshore? And that, may at times be the case. For example, for the humpback whales, that it is that search for food that brings them inshore. Having said that, we know some individuals remain offshore even at those times. So there can be changes in prey distribution, including distribution of those anchovy themselves, that sometimes they get sort of contracted and inshore, and that is definitely related to changes in environmental condition. And those can change from one year to the next. Hope that answered that question.
I think so, and maybe a related one here is has commercial fishing affected cetacean communities in the San Francisco Bay and West Coast?
I would say the primary effect there is, entanglement, incidental entanglement, which is a major source of mortality for both of these populations of endangered and threatened humpback whales.
Mhm.
I might add, it's not the only place where entanglement is a source of mortality. New Zealand, where I lived and worked for years, as the humpback whale population down there in the southern hemisphere was increasing in numbers, they saw an uptick, an increase in entanglement in their rock lobster fishery primarily. So, that is a concern. And the Marine Mammal Center response team, is working quite closely with the commercial fishing community to try to, help manage and mitigate, against that particular problem. As far as fisheries competing for the animals' food, I think probably largely not in this particular scenario.
Well, maybe a good way to end this note is from MJ Schramm, which is that the Farallones and Cordell Bank marine sanctuaries are working with the shipping industry and the United States Coast Guard on ship alerts. And you can go to the farallones.noaa.gov to see and see vessel issues page. So yeah, I mean, I think that any pressure that any of us can do by sending a letter or just generally being aware and asking these kind of questions, I think is a good thing. So
Yeah, and that excellent work that's being done out in the sanctuary waters to protect these animals with voluntary vessel slowdowns and monitoring, really helping to change that situation. So I think there's a lot of really excellent efforts underway.
Okay, well, Tim, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending tonight. There's always so much to learn, and we're just so fortunate to have these amazing creatures really outside in our backyard. So thank you, and we'll see you all in July, the fourth Tuesday, which is I think the 28th. We have another good talk ahead. So Tim, thank you so much, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you all. Bye, everybody. Are we done?
We're done. Hold on.